I'm Martha, 28 years old, and I'm sitting in my cozy Portland apartment watching the rain streak down my window. 10 months ago, I packed up my entire life in Ohio and moved 2,000 miles away. You'd think someone in my family would have noticed by now, right? Wrong. Not a single phone call asking where I went. Not one text wondering why I haven't been around. But yesterday my father called with an urgent demand about my brother's wedding, and when I told him I lived in Portland, the silence on the other end said everything. Now he's threatening to cut me out of the family inheritance because I won't drop everything to play the perfect daughter for his social image. Before we dive into this story about family dysfunction and finding your worth, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. Please hit that like button and subscribe, because trust me, you'll want to hear how this family drama unfolds. The manipulation tactics my father used will shock you, but my response will hopefully inspire you. Growing up in Cleveland, Ohio, I learned early that being the middle child meant being invisible. My parents, Harold and Beatrice, had their golden boy, Kenneth, my older brother, who could do absolutely no wrong. Star quarterback and high school valedictorian, full scholarship to Ohio State. Then there was my younger sister, Diane, the baby of the family who got endless attention just for existing. And somewhere in between was me, Martha, the forgotten middle child who might as well have been a piece of furniture. I can't count the number of times my parents missed my school plays because Kenneth had a game or Diane had a recital. When I graduated college with honors in accounting, they showed up 20 minutes late because they were helping Kenneth move into his new apartment. My promotion to senior accountant at Morrison & Associates barely got a congratulations text, while Kenneth's job interview at a marketing firm warranted a family dinner celebration. The pattern was so consistent, it became my normal. Birthday dinners where the conversation revolved around everyone else. Christmas mornings where my gifts were clearly afterthoughts picked up last minute, while Kenneth and Diane received thoughtful presents they'd been wanting for months. Family group chats that somehow never included me, even though I was sitting right there in the same room. I started keeping a mental tally of how often I spoke during family dinners versus how often anyone responded meaningfully. The ratio was depressing. I could share news about a big client I'd landed, and my mother would immediately pivot to asking Diane about her college classes or Kenneth about his girlfriend Patricia. It was like I existed in some alternate dimension where my words carried no weight. The breaking point came during our annual family photo session 2 years ago. The photographer kept positioning me in the back, slightly out of frame, while Kenneth and Diane flanked my parents in the center. When I suggested we try a different arrangement, my mother actually said, "Oh, honey, you're fine where you are. Kenneth and Diane photograph better in the front anyway." That comment hit me like a physical blow. No one seemed to notice my face fall or the way I went silent for the rest of the session. By the time the job transfer opportunity to Portland came up 8 months later, I realized I had unconsciously been preparing for this moment my entire adult life. Morrison & Associates was expanding their environmental consulting division to the Pacific Northwest, and they needed someone with my experience to head up the new office. The salary increase was substantial, the cost of living was manageable, and most importantly, it was 2,000 miles away from the family that barely acknowledged my existence. I decided to turn my move into an experiment. I wouldn't tell anyone about the transfer. I wouldn't mention that I was looking at apartments online or that I'd already accepted the position. If my family truly cared about me, surely someone would notice when I wasn't around anymore, right? The planning phase took 3 months, and not once did anyone ask why I was suddenly decluttering my apartment or why I seemed distracted during our monthly family dinners. The actual move happened on a rainy Thursday in March. I hired movers, packed up my life, and drove away from Ohio without a single goodbye. No farewell dinner, no family send-off, no tearful hugs at the airport. I simply vanished from their lives to see if anyone would notice the absence of someone they claimed to love. Portland welcomed me with open arms in a way my family never had. My new position at EcoConsult Solutions put me in charge of helping businesses reduce their environmental impact work that felt meaningful and important. My colleagues actually listened when I spoke, valued my input, and celebrated my achievements. For the first time in my adult life, I felt seen and appreciated for who I was, rather than constantly compared to my siblings. My coworker Joanne became my first real friend in the city. She was a few years older than me, originally from Boston, and had moved to Portland for similar reasons, seeking a fresh start after a difficult divorce. We bonded over our shared love of hiking and our experiences with complicated family dynamics. Joanne was the first person who ever told me that my family's treatment of me wasn't normal or acceptable. Through Joanne, I discovered a whole world I'd never known existed. We explored Powell's books together, spending entire Saturdays getting lost among the stacks. She introduced me to the farmers market scene where I learned to cook with fresh local ingredients instead of relying on frozen dinners and takeout. We hiked the Columbia River Gorge, visited the Japanese garden, and I fell in love with the natural beauty of the Pacific Northwest. I joined a book club at the local library, something I never would have had time for in Ohio, because family obligations always took precedence. The group met twice a month to discuss everything from contemporary fiction to historical biographies, and I found myself looking forward to these intellectual conversations with people who genuinely wanted to hear my thoughts and opinions. For the first time, I was forming friendships based on shared interests, rather than family connections or workplace proximity. The transformation wasn't just social, it was deeply personal. I started taking pottery classes at a community center, something I'd always wanted to try but never had the confidence to pursue. There's something incredibly grounding about working with clay, shaping something beautiful with your own hands. My instructor, an elderly woman named Grace, encouraged my artistic development in a way that reminded me what healthy mentorship looked like. Dating in Portland was a revelation. I met Carl, a high school English teacher, at a coffee shop where we both happened to be grading papers. He was kind, thoughtful, and genuinely interested in my life and experiences. Our first date lasted 6 hours because we kept finding new things to talk about. Carl listened to my stories about family dynamics without trying to fix everything or dismiss my feelings. He validated my experiences in a way that helped me understand just how dysfunctional my family relationships had been. With Carl's encouragement, I started setting up my apartment as a real home, rather than just a place to sleep. I bought plants and actually kept them alive. I invested in quality furniture instead of making do with hand-me-downs and college dorm leftovers. I hung artwork on the walls and created spaces that reflected my personality and interests. For the first time in my life, I was living somewhere that felt authentically mine. The phone calls from Ohio became increasingly infrequent and superficial. My mother would call every few weeks, usually while multitasking, and ask generic questions about work and weather, without really listening to my answers. Kenneth would text occasionally, usually when he needed advice about something, but never asked about my life or what I was doing. Diane's communication consisted entirely of social media likes and occasional forwarded memes. What struck me most was how little my absence seemed to affect the family dynamic. Based on the group photos they posted on social media, their lives continued exactly as they had before. Family dinners, holiday celebrations, weekend activities, all happening without me and apparently without anyone thinking something was missing. The experiment was proving my worst fears. I truly was invisible to the people who were supposed to love me most. As the months passed, my confidence grew stronger. I received recognition at work, earned a significant promotion, and was invited to speak at a regional conference about sustainable business practices. I was building a life that felt authentic and fulfilling, surrounded by people who valued my contributions and celebrated my successes. The contrast with my life in Ohio became more stark with each passing day. It was a Tuesday evening in January when everything changed. I was in my kitchen preparing dinner, listening to a podcast about environmental policy, when my phone rang. The caller ID showed Dad, which was unusual because Harold rarely called me directly. Our communication typically went through my mother, and even then it was usually brief and centered on logistics rather than genuine connection. Martha, His voice was unusually formal, almost businesslike. "I need to talk to you about Kenneth's wedding." I nearly dropped the wooden spoon I was holding. Kenneth was getting married. This was the first I'd heard of any engagement, let alone wedding plans. Patricia had been his girlfriend for 3 years, so it wasn't entirely surprising. But the fact that no one had bothered to tell me felt like another punch to the gut. "Wedding," I managed to say, trying to keep my voice neutral. "When did Kenneth get engaged?" "3 months ago," Harold replied, matter-of-factly as if I should have somehow known this major family news through telepathy. "The wedding is in 6 weeks. We're having it at Brookside Country Club, 300 guests, very elegant affair. Patricia's family has significant business connections, so this needs to be handled properly." The way he said, "handled properly," sent a chill down my spine. This wasn't about Kenneth's happiness or celebrating love. This was about Harold's social standing and business networking opportunities. Everything in our family always came back to how it would reflect on him professionally. "We need all the family photos to look perfect," he continued. "The photographer is very expensive, and Patricia's family is sparing no expense. You'll need to be fitted for a bridesmaid dress this weekend. Patricia wants all the sisters in lavender, so you'll need to coordinate with Diane about the shade." I felt my anger building, but I tried to stay calm. "Dad, I can't just drop everything for a wedding in 6 weeks. I live in Portland now." The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. I could practically hear the gears turning in his head as he processed this information. "What do you mean, you live in Portland?" His voice had shifted from businesslike to confused and slightly irritated. "I moved here 10 months ago for work. I took a transfer with my company to head up their new Pacific Northwest office." I waited for some acknowledgement of this major life change, some explanation for how he could have missed such significant news. "When did this happen?" he demanded, as if I had somehow deceived him by not sending a formal announcement. 10 months ago, Dad. I moved in March." The fact that I had to spell this out for him was both heartbreaking and infuriating. Another long pause. Then, instead of apologizing for not knowing about my cross-country relocation or asking how I was doing in my new city, he immediately pivoted back to his own agenda. "Well, you'll need to come back for the wedding regardless. This is Kenneth's big day, and we need the family to look perfect. Patricia's father owns 3 car dealerships and could be a valuable business connection. The photos will be published in the society section of the paper." I felt my jaw clench. Not once had he asked how I was doing, whether I liked Portland, if the move had been good for me, or even basic questions about my job. His only concern was how my absence might affect the family's appearance at this social event. "I can't just fly back to Ohio on 6 weeks' notice, Dad. I have responsibilities here, job commitments." "What commitments could be more important than your brother's wedding?" His tone was becoming more aggressive, more demanding. "This is Family Martha. Family comes first." The irony of that statement was so thick I almost laughed. Family comes first. Where had that philosophy been for the past 10 months? When no one bothered to check on me? Where was it during my childhood when my achievements were consistently overlooked in favor of Kenneth's and Diane's? "I'll need to check my schedule and see if I can arrange time off," I said, trying to buy myself some time to think. "Don't check anything," Harold snapped. "Just be there. The wedding is Saturday, February 22nd. I'll text you the details. And Martha, make sure you look appropriate. This isn't the time for any of your environmental hippie nonsense. Patricia's family is very traditional." Before I could respond, he hung up. I stood in my kitchen phone, still in my hand, staring at the wall and trying to process what had just happened. My brother was getting married in 6 weeks, and I was finding out about it through a demand for my attendance rather than a loving invitation. Not only had my family failed to notice my absence for 10 months, but now they expected me to drop everything and return to play my role in their perfect family performance. The next few days were a whirlwind of increasingly aggressive communication from my family. Harold called twice more each time, more demanding and less patient with my hesitation. He had clearly decided that my concerns about the short notice and my life in Portland were irrelevant obstacles to be steamrolled rather than legitimate considerations to be respected. "I don't understand what the problem is," he said during our second conversation. "It's a wedding, not a business trip. You fly back, you smile for photos, you participate in the ceremony, and then you can go back to whatever you're doing out there." The dismissive way he referred to my life as "whatever you're doing out there" stung more than I expected. I had built something meaningful in Portland, developed genuine relationships, found professional fulfillment, and created a home where I felt valued and respected. To him, it was just a temporary distraction from my real purpose, serving the family's image when needed. My mother called the next day with a different approach, but the underlying message was the same. Beatrice had always been the family's emotional manipulator, wielding guilt like a precision instrument. "Martha, honey, I just don't understand how you could even think about missing Kenneth's wedding," she said in her most wounded tone. "We're already dealing with so much stress planning this event, and now you're adding to it by being difficult." "I'm not being difficult, Mom. I'm just pointing out that 6 weeks' notice for a cross-country trip is unreasonable, especially when no one even told me Kenneth was engaged." "Well, we assumed you knew," she replied, which was obviously a lie. "Your family. Of course we assumed you'd want to be involved. How could I be involved when I live 2,000 miles away and no one tells me anything?" Beatrice sighed dramatically. "You know, sometimes I wonder if moving so far away was really about work, or if you're just trying to hurt the family. It feels very selfish, Martha. Very attention-seeking." The accusation of attention-seeking was rich, coming from a woman who had spent decades lavishing attention on Kenneth and Diane while ignoring me. But it was also classic Beatrice manipulation, turning my legitimate concerns into character flaws, making me the problem rather than addressing the family's dysfunction. Kenneth called me that evening, and his conversation was perhaps the most revealing of all. Unlike our parents, he seemed genuinely confused by the situation, rather than angry or manipulative. "Martha, I honestly had no idea you'd moved to Portland," he said. "When Dad told me you were being difficult about the wedding, I asked him what he meant, and that's when I found out you don't even live in Ohio anymore." This admission was somehow both validating and heartbreaking. It confirmed that my family's lack of awareness about my life wasn't intentional cruelty. It was genuine indifference. They weren't deliberately ignoring my move. They simply cared so little about my day-to-day existence that they hadn't noticed I was gone. "How long have you been out there?" Kenneth asked, and I could hear real curiosity in his voice rather than the dismissiveness I'd gotten from our parents. 10 months, I told him. 10 months. His voice rose in surprise. "And nobody knew. Nobody asked," I replied simply. There was a long pause before Kenneth spoke again. "I guess I never really thought about it, but you're right. We don't really keep track of each other very well, do we?" It was the closest thing to an acknowledgement of our family's dysfunction that I'd ever heard from any of my siblings. Kenneth wasn't malicious like our father, or manipulative like our mother. He was just self-absorbed in the way that golden children often are, accustomed to being the center of attention and assuming everyone else's lives revolved around his orbit. "Look, I do want you at the wedding," he continued. "Patricia likes you, and it would mean something to have you there. But I can understand if 6 weeks isn't enough notice for you to arrange everything." His tone was reasonable, almost apologetic, which made my father's aggressive demands seem even more unreasonable by comparison. This was how the conversation should have gone from the beginning, a loving invitation with understanding for my circumstances, rather than a command to comply with the family's expectations. But then the pressure campaign really began in earnest. Diane sent a series of increasingly hostile text messages accusing me of being selfish and self-centered. "This is typical Martha behavior," one message read. "Making everything about yourself instead of supporting the family." The family group chat that had never included me was suddenly expanded to add my number, but only so they could collectively shame me for my unreasonable position. Aunts and uncles I hadn't spoken to in years suddenly started calling with concerns about my mental state and my decision to abandon the family. The most manipulative call came from Harold 3 days later when he decided to escalate to serious threats. His voice was cold and calculated in a way that reminded me why I'd always been afraid of disappointing him as a child. "I've been thinking about your attitude regarding Kenneth's wedding," he began, "and I think we need to have a very frank conversation about what it means to be part of this family." I felt my stomach drop. Harold only used that tone when he was about to deliver an ultimatum. "Your grandfather worked very hard to build the wealth that this family enjoys today," he continued. "The house, the investments, the college funds that paid for your education, all of that came from his sacrifice and smart financial planning. That legacy is something I've been very careful to preserve and grow for the next generation." He paused to let the implications sink in before delivering the threat directly. "But that legacy is for family members who understand their obligations and responsibilities. If you choose to prioritize your own convenience over Kenneth's wedding, if you choose to embarrass this family in front of Patricia's relatives and our business associates, then perhaps you've decided that being part of this family isn't important to you." The threat was clear: attend the wedding or be disinherited. Harold had always used money as a tool of control, and now he was wielding it like a weapon. The inheritance he was threatening included not just future money, but also sentimental items like my grandmother's jewelry, family photos, and mementos that connected me to generations of relatives who had actually loved me. "I want to be very clear about what I'm saying, Martha. This isn't just about one day. This is about whether you're committed to being part of this family, or if you've decided to pursue your own selfish interests instead. The choice is yours, but choices have consequences." After he hung up, I sat in my Portland apartment feeling like I'd been punched in the gut. The family that had barely noticed my existence for 10 months was now threatening to officially cut me off because I wouldn't drop everything to play my assigned role in their social performance. That night I called in sick to work for the first time since moving to Portland. I couldn't concentrate on environmental impact assessments when my entire relationship with my family was hanging in the balance. I spent the day walking through Forest Park, trying to clear my head and figure out what I really wanted. The financial threat was real and significant. My grandfather had built a successful construction business, and the family assets included not just cash and investments, but also the house I'd grown up in and valuable real estate holdings. Being cut off from that inheritance would mean losing not just money, but also my connection to family history and memories. But as I walked through the towering Douglas firs and breathed in the clean Pacific air, I realized something important. For the first time in my adult life, I was financially stable and emotionally healthy without my family's support. I had built something real in Portland, something that belonged to me and reflected my values rather than my family's expectations. Joanne met me for dinner that evening, and I told her everything about the wedding ultimatum and the inheritance threat. Her response was immediate and unambiguous. "Martha, this is emotional blackmail," she said firmly. "Healthy families don't threaten to disown someone for having scheduling conflicts. Healthy families don't notice you've moved across the country." She was right, but knowing something intellectually and feeling it emotionally are two different things. I had spent 28 years learning to prioritize my family's needs over my own, and breaking that pattern felt like betraying everything I'd been taught about loyalty and obligation. Carl had a different perspective when I talked to him about it the next day. As a teacher, he had experience with family dynamics and had seen how parental manipulation could damage young people's sense of self-worth. "Let me ask you something," he said as we sat in his living room drinking coffee. "If you go back to Ohio for this wedding, what happens afterward? Do you think your relationship with your family will improve? Or do you think they'll just expect you to continue prioritizing their demands over your own life?" It was a question I hadn't considered, but the answer was obvious. If I gave in to Harold's ultimatum now, I would be setting a precedent that his threats were effective tools for controlling my behavior. Every future family event, every crisis, every time they needed me to play my role, would come with the same expectation that I would drop everything and comply. "And what about your life here?" Carl continued. "You've built something amazing in Portland. You have friends who value you, work that fulfills you, a home that makes you happy. Are you willing to sacrifice that progress to maintain a relationship with people who didn't even notice you were gone for 10 months? His questions forced me to confront the reality of my situation. My family didn't want a genuine relationship with me. They wanted a prop for their social performances. They didn't care about my happiness, my achievements, or my well-being. They cared about maintaining their image of family unity when it served their purposes. I made an appointment with a therapist that week, something I'd been considering for months but hadn't prioritized. Dr. Sarah Collins specialized in family dysfunction and helped me understand that what I was experiencing had a name: emotional neglect and conditional love. Your family has trained you to believe that your worth is tied to your usefulness to them, she explained during our first session. When you're not useful, you become invisible. When they need you to be useful again, they use guilt and threats to manipulate your compliance. She helped me see that my move to Portland hadn't been running away from family problems. It had been running toward emotional health and authentic relationships. The contrast between how I felt in Ohio versus how I felt in Portland wasn't coincidental. It was the difference between a toxic environment and a healthy one. The question you need to ask yourself, Dr. Collins said, is whether you want to spend the rest of your life trying to earn love from people who are fundamentally incapable of giving it unconditionally, or whether you want to invest in relationships with people who already see your worth. As I reflected on her words over the following days, I realized that I already knew my answer. The family I had built in Portland, the chosen family of friends and colleagues and romantic partners who actually cared about my well-being, was more real and nurturing than the biological family that had failed to notice my absence. The decision crystallized during a book club meeting that Thursday. We were discussing a novel about a woman who leaves her controlling family to start a new life, and the parallels to my own situation were impossible to ignore. When I shared what I was going through, the response from my book club friends was unanimous and supportive. "You don't owe anyone your presence if they don't value your existence," said Margaret, a retired teacher who had dealt with her own family estrangement issues. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for yourself is to stop trying to force relationships that aren't meant to be. That night I sat down and wrote out my response to Harold's ultimatum. I wanted to be clear and firm without being cruel or vindictive. I wanted to set boundaries while leaving the door open for genuine reconciliation if anyone in my family was ever interested in a real relationship. The phone call with Harold happened on a Friday evening. I had rehearsed what I wanted to say, but I still felt my heart racing as I dialed his number. He answered on the second ring, his voice already impatient. "I hope you're calling to tell me you've come to your senses about Kenneth's wedding," he said without preamble. "I'm calling to tell you that I won't be attending," I replied, trying to keep my voice calm and steady. "I understand you're disappointed, but I've made my decision." The silence that followed was longer and more ominous than any of our previous conversations. When Harold finally spoke, his voice was ice cold. "I see. So you're choosing to abandon your family obligations for whatever selfish pursuits you found out there." "I'm choosing to prioritize my mental health and well-being," I corrected. "And I'm choosing not to participate in relationships that are based on threats and manipulation rather than love and respect." "Manipulation," his voice rose. "I'm trying to keep this family together, and you're calling it manipulation. Dad, you threatened to disinherit me because I can't attend a wedding I found out about 6 weeks beforehand. You've called me selfish and difficult for having scheduling conflicts. You didn't even know I'd moved across the country 10 months ago. How is any of that about love or family unity?" I could hear him breathing heavily on the other end of the line, and I knew I had hit a nerve. Harold wasn't used to being challenged or having his behavior questioned. "You have always been ungrateful," he said finally. "Your mother and I gave you everything, paid for your education, supported you through college, and this is how you repay us. By embarrassing us in front of Patricia's family. You didn't give me everything, Dad. You gave me material things while withholding emotional support and genuine attention. There's a difference between providing for a child and actually caring about them as a person. I was surprised by my own boldness, but years of suppressed frustration were finally finding their voice. I continued before he could interrupt. When I graduated college with honors, you showed up late because Kenneth needed help moving. When I got promoted to senior accountant, you barely acknowledged it. When I won the Morrison account that saved my department from layoffs, you changed the subject to talk about Diane's grades. I've spent 28 years trying to earn recognition and approval that you've never been willing to give. That's ridiculous, Harold protested, but his voice lacked conviction. We've always been proud of you. Have you? Can you tell me the name of my company in Portland? Do you know what I do for work? Do you know who I'm dating or whether I'm happy here? Do you know anything about my life beyond what you need from me to maintain the family image? Another long silence. The fact that he couldn't answer any of those basic questions proved my point more effectively than any argument I could make. This conversation is over, he said finally. You've made your choice, and you'll have to live with the consequences. Don't come crying to us when you realize what you've thrown away. I'm not throwing anything away, Dad. I'm choosing to stop accepting scraps of attention and calling it love. I'm choosing to invest in relationships with people who actually value me as a person rather than as a prop for their social performances. He hung up without another word. I sat in my living room phone still in my hand and felt a strange combination of sadness and relief. The sadness was for the relationship we'd never had and probably never would have. The relief was for finally speaking my truth after decades of swallowing my feelings to keep the peace. My mother called within an hour, clearly having been briefed by Harold on our conversation. Her approach was different but equally manipulative. "Martha, honey, your father is very upset," she began in her most martyred tone. "I don't understand why you're being so hurtful. This is Kenneth's special day and you're ruining it with your selfishness." "Mom, I'm not ruining anything. Kenneth will have a beautiful wedding surrounded by people who care about him. My absence won't change that." "But the family photos won't be complete," she protested. "What will people think when they see that one of the children isn't there? They'll think that one of the children lives across the country and couldn't make it on short notice," I replied. "Normal people don't assume family dysfunction based on missing wedding photos." Beatrice tried several more guilt tactics, but I had finally developed immunity to her emotional manipulation. When she realized her usual strategies weren't working, she resorted to Harold's approach. "Well, I hope you know that this means you're choosing to leave the family," she said. "Your father won't forgive this kind of betrayal, and honestly, I'm not sure I will either. If loving acceptance is conditional on my ability to drop everything for family events I'm not properly invited to, then maybe I don't want that kind of love," I told her. After she hung up, I called Kenneth directly. I wanted him to hear my perspective from me, rather than from our parents' filtered version of events. "I'm sorry I won't be at your wedding," I told him honestly. "I hope you and Patricia have a wonderful day and a happy marriage." Kenneth was quiet for a moment before responding. "I understand why you're not coming," he said finally. "I don't like it, but I understand it." It was more acknowledgement than I'd expected from him, and it gave me hope that maybe someday we could have a real relationship as adults, rather than just playing our assigned childhood roles. The wedding proceeded without me, and based on the social media photos, it looked beautiful and elegant. Patricia looked radiant, Kenneth looked happy, and my parents looked appropriately proud and successful. The family photos were perfectly composed, with Diane seamlessly filling the sister role without any obvious gap where I should have been. What surprised me was the response from extended family members. Several cousins reached out privately to express support for my decision and to share their own experiences with family pressure and unrealistic expectations. My cousin Sharon, whom I'd always liked but rarely spoke to, called to tell me that she'd been planning her own escape from family dysfunction for years. "Your courage to set boundaries is inspiring," she told me. "I've been watching from the sidelines, and I think you did the right thing." The weeks following Kenneth's wedding were a period of intense emotional processing. Initially, I felt profound grief for the family relationships I'd officially lost, even though they had never been healthy or nurturing. There's something deeply painful about acknowledging that the people who raised you are incapable of loving you the way you need and deserve to be loved. Dr. Collins helped me understand that grieving the loss of dysfunctional family relationships is a necessary part of healing. You're not just mourning the relationships you had, she explained. You're mourning the relationships you hoped you could have someday. The grief was complicated by guilt. Despite everything, I felt terrible about missing Kenneth's wedding and causing family drama during what should have been a celebration. Harold's accusation that I was being selfish echoed in my mind, even though logically I knew I had made the right choice for my mental health. Guilt is often the last tool that manipulative people use to control your behavior, Dr. Collins reminded me. The fact that you feel guilty about setting healthy boundaries shows how deeply your family has conditioned you to prioritize their needs over your own well-being. Gradually, the acute emotional pain began to soften into something more manageable. I found myself sleeping better, eating more regularly, and feeling less anxious about checking my phone. The constant low-level stress of trying to maintain relationships with people who fundamentally didn't respect me was finally lifting. My Portland friends rallied around me during this difficult period in ways that highlighted the contrast between chosen family and biological family. Joanne brought me homemade soup when I was too sad to cook. Carl took me hiking on weekends to help me process my emotions in nature. My book club friends checked in regularly and shared their own stories of family estrangement and healing. At work, I threw myself into a major project helping a local brewery reduce their water usage and waste production. The tangible positive impact of my environmental consulting work felt especially meaningful during a time when everything else in my life felt uncertain and painful. My colleagues noticed my extra dedication and nominated me for a regional award recognizing innovative sustainability practices. 3 months after the wedding, Kenneth called me unexpectedly. He had never reached out independently before, so I was curious about what prompted the contact. I wanted to tell you that Patricia and I had a long conversation about you and the wedding situation, he said. She asked me a lot of questions about our family dynamics that I'd never really thought about before. Patricia, it turned out, had grown up in a loving, communicative family where siblings maintained close relationships into adulthood. She couldn't understand why Kenneth barely knew anything about my life, or why our parents had been so angry about my absence rather than concerned about my well-being. She made me realize that we don't really know each other very well, Kenneth continued. Not as adults, anyway. We know each other as the kids we used to be, but I don't know who you are now or what your life is like. It was the most self-aware thing I'd ever heard him say, and it gave me hope for the possibility of rebuilding our relationship on more honest terms. I'd like to change that if you're interested, he said. Maybe we could talk on the phone sometimes, or I could visit Portland someday. Patricia really wants to see the Pacific Northwest. I was cautiously optimistic about Kenneth's outreach, but I also knew that real change would require sustained effort over time. One conversation couldn't undo decades of emotional distance and family dysfunction. 6 months after the wedding, I received an unexpected email from my mother. It was stilted and awkward, clearly written and rewritten multiple times, but it was an attempt at communication. I've been thinking about our last conversation, she wrote, and I realize there are things I don't know about your life in Portland. If you're willing, I'd like to hear about what you're doing out there. It wasn't an apology or an acknowledgement of her role in our family's problems, but it was a small opening toward a different kind of relationship. I responded with basic information about my work and my life, nothing too personal or vulnerable, but enough to keep the door slightly ajar. Harold never contacted me directly, but I heard through Kenneth that he was struggling with the family dynamics in ways he'd never had to before. Patricia's questions about why one of Kenneth's sisters wasn't at the wedding had apparently prompted some uncomfortable conversations among our extended family and family friends. A year after my decision to skip the wedding, I felt ready to take a bigger step toward healing. I bought my first house in Portland, a small craftsman bungalow with a garden and a view of Mount Hood on clear days. The mortgage was entirely in my name, paid for with my own salary and savings, representing a level of independence and stability I'd never imagined possible. Carl helped me move in, and we spent the weekend painting walls and planting vegetables in the backyard garden. Joanne organized a housewarming party, where my Portland friends celebrated this milestone with the enthusiasm and genuine happiness that my family had never shown for my achievements. Standing in my own living room, surrounded by people who truly cared about my happiness and success, I realized that I had created exactly the kind of life I'd always wanted. I had meaningful work that aligned with my values, friendships based on mutual respect and affection, a romantic relationship with someone who supported my growth and independence, and a home that reflected my personality and priorities. The contrast with my life in Ohio was stark and undeniable. In Portland, I was seen, valued, celebrated, and loved for who I was, rather than for how well I fulfilled other people's expectations. The family I had chosen was healthier and more nurturing than the family I had been born into. As I reflect on this journey now, 2 years after making the decision that changed everything, I understand that healing from family dysfunction is an ongoing process rather than a destination. There are still days when I miss the idea of having a close, loving family, even though I never actually had that experience in reality. The inheritance threat never materialized into actual disinheritance, probably because Harold realized that cutting me off completely would raise too many questions among other family members and business associates. Instead, we've settled into a pattern of distant but cordial communication, like distant relatives who exchange Christmas cards, but don't really know each other's lives. Kenneth and I have slowly built a genuine adult relationship through regular phone calls and video chats. He and Patricia visited Portland last fall, and it was the first time I'd ever spent time with my brother without the pressure of family performance and competition. We talked honestly about our childhood, our parents' favoritism, and the ways their dysfunction had affected both of us differently. "I always knew you got overlooked," he admitted during their visit, "but I didn't realize how much it hurt you or how bad it really was. I was so focused on meeting their expectations and maintaining my position as the golden child that I didn't pay attention to what was happening to you." His acknowledgement meant more to me than any apology could have. It validated my experiences and helped me understand that the family dysfunction I'd experienced wasn't imaginary or exaggerated. My relationship with Diane has remained more complicated. She still sees my decision to skip the wedding as a betrayal, and continues to prioritize maintaining peace with our parents over confronting difficult truths about our family dynamics. I've learned to accept that not every family relationship can be repaired or rebuilt, and that's okay. Dr. Collins helped me understand that I can't control other people's willingness to grow and change. I can only control my own responses and boundaries. Some family members may never be capable of the kind of honest, respectful relationship I need, and accepting that reality is part of my healing process. The work I'm doing in Portland continues to evolve and grow. I was promoted to regional director last year, overseeing environmental consulting projects across the entire Pacific Northwest. The award I received for the brewery project led to speaking opportunities at sustainability conferences where I get to share my expertise with other professionals who are passionate about protecting the environment. Carl and I got engaged 6 months ago, and we're planning a small wedding ceremony in the Columbia River Gorge next spring. We've invited Kenneth and Patricia, and they're excited to attend. I haven't decided whether to invite my parents, and I've made peace with the fact that I don't need to decide until I'm ready. The engagement has brought up interesting emotions about family and marriage. Carl's parents have been incredibly welcoming and inclusive, treating me like a daughter from the moment we met. The contrast with my own family's emotional distance is stark, but it's also helped me understand what healthy family relationships actually look like. The most profound lesson I've learned through this experience is that family isn't just about blood relations. It's about people who consistently show up for each other with love, support, and genuine care. The family I've built in Portland, the chosen family of friends and colleagues and partners who celebrate my successes and support me through challenges, is more real and meaningful than the biological family that never learned to see me as a complete person. I've also learned that setting boundaries isn't selfish or cruel. It's necessary for maintaining your mental health and self-respect. You can't force people to treat you better, but you can choose not to accept treatment that diminishes your worth or damages your well-being. Sometimes people ask me if I regret missing Kenneth's wedding or if I wish I had handled the situation differently. The honest answer is that I regret the family dysfunction that made such a choice necessary, but I don't regret prioritizing my own emotional health and standing up for myself. That decision was a turning point that allowed me to stop trying to earn love from people who were fundamentally incapable of giving it unconditionally. It freed me to invest in relationships with people who actually value my presence, rather than just my compliance with their expectations. The distance from Ohio has given me perspective on patterns that were invisible when I was trapped inside them. I can see now that my family's treatment of me wasn't personal. It was the result of their own emotional limitations and dysfunctional patterns they inherited from previous generations. Understanding that doesn't excuse their behavior or mean I need to tolerate it, but it does help me feel less angry and more compassionate toward people who are stuck in cycles they may not even recognize. The most important thing I want others to know is that you don't have to accept crumbs of attention and call it love. You don't have to prioritize other people's comfort over your own well-being. You don't have to maintain relationships that consistently make you feel invisible, unworthy, or unloved. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for yourself is to create distance from people who can't or won't treat you with basic respect and kindness. Sometimes building the life you want requires disappointing people who have never prioritized your happiness anyway. And sometimes, when you stop chasing people who don't value your presence, you create space for relationships with people who genuinely appreciate everything you have to offer. If you're dealing with similar family dynamics, I want you to know that you deserve better. You deserve to be seen, heard, valued, and loved for who you are, rather than for how well you meet other people's expectations. You deserve relationships that add joy and support to your life, rather than stress and obligation. The path toward healthier relationships and better boundaries isn't easy, and it often involves grieving the family connections you hope to have. But on the other side of that grief is the possibility of building a life filled with people who actually see your worth and celebrate your existence. Your worth isn't determined by your family's ability to recognize it. Your value doesn't depend on other people's approval or acceptance. You have the right to create a life that reflects your values and priorities, even if that disappoints people who want you to remain small and manageable. The family that notices when you're gone, celebrates when you succeed, and supports you through challenges is out there waiting for you to find them. Sometimes that family includes blood relatives who are capable of growth and change, and sometimes it's entirely composed of people you choose along the way. Either way, you deserve to be surrounded by love that doesn't come with conditions, threats, or ultimatums. You deserve relationships that make you feel more like yourself rather than less. And you deserve the courage to keep looking until you find them. Have you ever had to choose between family obligation and your own well-being? I'd love to hear your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. Please like this video if my story resonated with you, and subscribe for more content about setting healthy boundaries and building authentic relationships. Share this with anyone who might need to hear that they're not alone in dealing with difficult family dynamics. Thank you for listening to my story and for being part of this community where we can talk honestly about the complicated reality of family relationships. I'm sending you all love and encouragement on your own journeys toward healthier, happier lives. Remember that you deserve to be valued, respected, and loved exactly as you are.